throughout this 50-page filing, they also go through and include snippets of Teixeira's social media posts in which he talks about killing people.
Right.
The filing includes details about the weapons he possesses, and including some of his internet searches. And it also even referenced an incident back in high school where a classmate overheard him talk about Molotov cocktails.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, the Pentagon is still reeling over these leaks. We have a suspect in custody. We've learned a little bit more about what went down. Where do we stand right now?
Earlier today, there was a hearing to determine whether he would remain detained until his trial date. And so the judge left. He concluded the hearing, but didn't announce any ruling. So we're still waiting to hear whether or not this Air National Guardsman Jack Teixeira will remain behind bars until the hearing or until the trial takes place. That being said, we know from different court filings and the arguments that both sides presented in court that the prosecutors do believe he poses a serious security risk should he be given bail. We also heard, his defense attorneys argue that he should be released, even if that means, imposing restrictions on him, like making him wear a tracker, or preventing him from using the internet, or preventing him from contact possible witnesses in the case. So we really don't know exactly which way the judge will lean, though he was a little skeptical of the argument that some of the defense attorneys made, so there might be some indication of where he may ultimately go. That being said, the prosecutors filed a motion beforehand, and it really gave some insight into what their argument would look like. And within this document, which was an extensive 50-page document, it alleged some pretty unnerving things about Teixeira's alleged actions.
Right.
Some of the things he allegedly did were he destroyed a laptop, he destroyed a tablet, and he destroyed an Xbox gaming console that he presumably was using to spread this classified information.
So people felt that was destruction of evidence?
Absolutely. And so prosecutors allege that this behavior shows that he was intentionally trying to destroy evidence,
right.
And that there is still the possibility that he could go back and destroy additional evidence that hasn't yet been uncovered.
Right.
And so there really is, throughout this 50-page filing, they also go through and include snippets of Teixeira's social media posts in which he talks about killing people.
Right.
The filing includes details about the weapons he possesses, and including some of his internet searches, and it also even referenced an incident back in high school where a classmate overheard him talk about Molotov cocktails, and the incident was reported to police, and ultimately this incident prevented the police from approving a gun permit for him. And so there does seem to be a number of questions based on pieces of information included in this filing as to why Airman Teixeira had access to this information and why he made it to the military to begin with, given some of these red flags that we now know. We haven't heard many answers from the Pentagon on this yet. They keep saying that there's an investigation ongoing, and they don't want to get ahead of the investigation. They don't want to provide details before the conclusions are founded.
Right.
And so they really have demurred on a lot of these questions. They really haven't provided much insight, but we do know from officials that the Pentagon has already started restricting access of classified information for some individuals, and essentially the premise is there's a belief now that too many people have access to these classified documents,
right.
And so at a minimum they've started shrinking the number of people who have access to certain documents based on what's relevant to their work, and we could see more of this, and we probably should expect to see more of this once DOD comes out with the results of this investigation and any subsequent policy changes.
Have there been any consequences to anybody who sort of worked with Teixeira or who was responsible for his access to this classified information?
Great question. The top two leaders of his unit, the 102nd Intelligence Wing, based in Boston, have been suspended temporarily. They've had their access to classified information restricted temporarily. and we've heard from the Air Force that these two individuals very well could resume their positions pending the conclusion of the larger investigation, and also that other people could face consequences as well still.
So all of this is going against the backdrop of a planned counteroffensive in Ukraine conducted by the Ukrainian government against Russian positions, Russian-held territory. There's some dispute over whether the United States and the West has done enough to supply Ukraine ahead of this counteroffensive so that it will be successful. What are we hearing in that regard? What are people saying about whether future aid might be conditioned on the success of this counteroffensive?
So it's important to note that the U.S. isn't doing this alone. The U.S., with all of their Western partners, their NATO allies, have spent the last couple months pouring weapons, pouring ammunition, and pouring tanks and armored vehicles into Ukraine to prepare them for what is expected to be this, highly anticipated counteroffensive that's expected to come in the ensuing weeks. And so we heard earlier this week from General Christopher Cavoli, who's the head of U.S. forces in Europe and is in charge of NATO forces overall, that they've committed Western countries more than 500 tanks to Ukraine, many of which are already there, though the ones the U.S. are providing haven't gotten there yet.
Right.
But he really is, he talked a lot about when he testified in front of Congress this week that they really are making progress in speeding up the delivery of these weapons, trying to really speed up the training and condense the training so that when they do have to provide this training to Ukrainians, it doesn't take them off the battlefield for too long. There is a lot of anticipation going into this counteroffensive back home in the U.S. Because there's some expectation, and we've heard rumblings of this from Capitol Hill, that support for continuing to aid Ukraine is waning a little bit. And a lot of this is likely contingent upon Ukraine's success in the coming offensive. And so if Ukraine is able to once again surprise and surpass expectations, it's believed that support for aiding Ukraine continuing will remain high. Now, if a more pessimistic outlook happens, if it looks like it will continue to be a stalemate, we've seen lawmakers already talk about looking towards resolutions, whatever that means, but getting both sides to the table.
Trying to have some kind of negotiated settlement.
Exactly, and we've heard the Biden administration say over and over and over again that they're not interested in that, and that it will be entirely up to Ukrainian President Zelensky to determine when he's ready for his country to go to the negotiating table. And there are certain red lines that he has drawn in the sand that the U.S. is not willing to push him on. And so unless those red lines are met under President Zelensky's conditions, Ukraine's not heading to the negotiating table anytime soon, and the U.S. isn't likely to force them there.
Has there been any discussion of what's the holdup with the U.S. supplied tanks?
There have been some discussions about whether the U.S. is really doing as much as they can to get them there as quickly as possible. Now, it's not quite as simple as we heard some lawmakers make it out to be. There are very specific tanks that the U.S. wants to give Ukraine, and not every tank that the U.S. has is equipped for the way these tanks plan, the tanks that they plan on giving to the Ukrainians. So it's not as simple as picking 31, which is the number of the tanks the U.S. agreed to provide because it's the size of a Ukrainian tank battalion. It's not as simple as picking those 31 out of all of the tanks the U.S. has, whether that's in the continental United States or bringing them in from abroad, as they've done some other weaponry. There really are some difficult hurdles that they have to go through in terms of making sure that the very precise tanks that they want for Ukraine get to Ukraine. But we already know, we heard from Secretary Austin last week, that the training tanks, or the tanks that Ukrainians will be training on, will reach Germany, where the training will happen in the next couple weeks. Though these training tanks are not combat operational and thus won't end up in Ukraine, Ukrainians will learn on them, and then the U.S. will provide different tanks to Ukraine for the battlefield.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.